This video is direct criticism of the Australian government's policy, their so-called fuel efficiency policy, which they are bringing in starting in 2025, which they claim will make motoring cheaper. It will do the exact opposite, and I'll give you some examples to show you why. Firstly, the cheapest new car currently available in Australia is the tiny Kia Pisanto. It's around about, they say, under $20,000, around the $20,000 mark. That's the cheapest new car you can buy, a little small micro car. Now its fuel efficiency is 5.5 litres for every 100 kilometres that it travels. And that works out at a rating of 117 grams of CO2 per kilometre. So how does that 117 fit in with this new regime of so-called fuel efficiency standards that the government is putting in? And if you're over those standards, you have to pay a fine. You have to pay a fine of $100 for every gram of CO2 that you're above the government's threshold. Now, firstly, it's at 117 grams of CO2 per kilometre. It's under the threshold for 2025, which is 141 grams. It's also under the threshold for 2026, which is 117 grams of CO2 per kilometre. But when we get to 2027, which is only in 2 years' time, this tiny little micro car will actually have to pay a fine, or because the fine will be paid by the manufacturer and passed on to the consumer. One of the great furphies that the government says, oh, no, it's not a tax, the consumer doesn't pay it. That is technically correct, because the consumer doesn't pay it, the car manufacturer pays it, and he will then pass this fine on to the consumer. So here we have this tiny little car, this Kia Pisanto, which is the cheapest car currently available in the market at the moment. In 2 years' time, it will be 25 grams of CO2 because it will be above the threshold at 117 grams of CO2, above that threshold for 2027 of 92 grams, 25 grams over. Therefore, there'll be a fine attached to that car of $2,500. And it goes up the next year when the threshold goes down, where the fine cuts in, to 68 grams of CO2 per kilometre. The fine for this little car will become $4,900. And in 2029, the threshold goes down to 58 grams of CO2. So this little car will be 59 grams of CO2 over at 117 grams of CO2 per kilometre. So the fine for this tiny little micro car in 4 years' time will be $5,900 extra that motorists will have to pay if they want to buy this car. Then look at the example of the tiny little micro Fiat 500, made in Poland, a little two-door car, about as small as they come as new cars on the market today. Well, first, a little car like this, brand new, costs around $28,000. And it's more efficient than the Kia. Its fuel efficiency is 4.8 litres for every 100 kilometres. So that gives it a rating, a CO2 rating, of 111 grams of CO2 for every kilometre it travels. So this year it escapes the fine. Next year it escapes the fine, 2026. But when we get to 2027, that 111 grams of CO2 is above the government's threshold of 92 grams of CO2 that's allowed. So if we're looking at this tiny little micro car, one of the most fuel efficient cars on the market, a Fiat 500, there's no fine in 2025 this year. There's no fine next year. But when we get to 2027, in 2 years' time, the government will fine you if you buy this car because they say it's not fuel efficient enough. So when we get to 2027 and the government's threshold is down to 92 grams of CO2 per kilometre, this tiny little micro car at 111 grams of CO2 per kilometre will be 19 grams above So there'll be a $1,900 fine on this car. In 2028, the fine will go up again because the threshold will come down to 68 grams of CO2. So this little car will find itself 43 grams of CO2 above the government's threshold, which will be a $4,300 fine that motorists will end up having to be paid. Yes, the car companies have to pay it, but they'll just pass this cost on to motorists. And when we get to 2029, when the threshold goes down to 58 grams of CO2, this little car will be 53 grams of CO2 above the threshold. So anyone buying this car will be looking at a $5,300 fine from the government for buying it, because the government wants us to buy more fuel-efficient cars, and yet this is one of the most fuel-efficient cars on the market. This policy is an absolute disaster. It is one of the worst policies that I've ever seen introduced into the federal parliament, and there's been a lot of them, a lot of very bad policies. But fortunately, to get under that 58 grams of CO2, even the hybrid cars can't get under that, but there is one little petrol car coming onto the market that will achieve that fuel efficiency, which is around about 2.5 litres, like a big bottle of Coke worth of petrol that will get you 100 kilometres. And that here it is pictured here. This is the Albo Mobile, which will be released in 2028 and 2029. And this is the way you get away about avoiding fines and how the government is going to encourage you to buy a more fuel efficient car. Motorists need to have a close look at this policy. Anyone that is thinking of buying a new car within the next 4 years needs to consider, when they go to the ballot box in the next couple of months, how much more this policy of the Albanese government is going to cost them if they want to buy a new car, how much it will push up the price of second-hand cars, because it makes, as new cars become more expensive, second-hand cars will become more expensive to buy as well. And what will this do if Australians are forced to buy smaller, more lightweight cars than what they would normally wish to buy depending on their circumstances and conditions? This policy is a disaster. The Libertarians oppose it. It should be scrapped. But at the moment, the Liberal Party have said nothing about this policy. They seem to be going along with Labor, happy for it to go along as part of Australia's net zero commitments and our so-called Paris target commitments. So get ready. If you want to buy a new petrol car in the next couple of years, you're going to have to pay thousands of dollars more to the Albanese government as a fine.